Hello, and welcome to another edition of What's Up Missoula, where MCAT interviews representatives from nonprofit organizations. With us today is Steve Korek for Volume 2 about the VoteTrustUSA organization, which is trying to help us figure out better ways to get our votes counted in this country and in Montana. Welcome again, Steve.
Thank you, Ricky.
Now, tell me, we were talking before about a lot of the problems that have occurred in Montana and across the country, and I wonder, are there any representatives from any government officials or politicians who are against trying to make our voting system better?
Well, I think what they would all say is that they're dedicated to making it better, but I question whether the results of their actions necessarily do. Just as an example, when HAVA was passed, the Help America Vote Act was passed by Congress in 2002, its primary sponsor, John Ensign, who's a Republican senator from Nevada, said that it included a requirement for voter-verified paper trail. Well, something happened to it in committee, and by the time it got out of committee, the language had been changed just enough so that all the interpretations have been that that legislation does not require a voter-verified paper trail. This is a real problem with Congress, is you think you get one bill and then something happens in committee, or in the negotiating committee between the Senate and the House. So there are some folks. One of the kind of the poster child for suppressing the possibility of having a paper trail is Representative Bob Nye, who's a representative from Ohio, who was head of the House Appropriations Committee and is now the #1 target in the Abramoff scandal. He's the one representative who's really been shown to have done a fair number of stuff that probably was illegal under the fairly broad and lax standards of the House and the Senate. So but he was in charge of making these decisions. It was his subcommittee that decided about voting systems, and he had a pretty strong role in what finally came out of the.
So what is that subcommittee?
Well, it's I believe it's the Appropriations Subcommittee within the House.
Okay.
Yeah.
What can people do to try to get the system improved?
Well, there's a lot of things. There's a lot of really great organizations out there. I work with VoteTrustUSA.org, and they're a national organization that are basically a collection of verified voting and vote assistance organizations. There's about 50 different organizations in them. In there, I'm just a volunteer like most people are, but they have a very high competence, high, 12-hour-a-day staff who are working on this issue all the time. They are among the sponsors of U.S. Representative Rush Holt's bill, House Bill 550, which is an attempt to implement national standards that would require voter-verified paper. They're doing a lot of education at a state level. They've had a lot of success. Right now, there are 26 states that require some form of voter-verified paper. That also means there are 24 that don't. So there's still a lot of work to do, and some of those that do, there's still some more work to refine the legislation that they've passed or that's been passed by the voters.
Now, I remember before when we were off camera, we had this little conversation, so let's just have it again.
Okay.
My idea is, well, you know, when you buy a lottery ticket, there's a number on there. You own that lottery ticket. It belongs. It's my lottery ticket. It's my number. No one else has that number. It shows the numbers that I chose, as I could do in voting, and then I walk away with a serial number. And then let's say that we did that with voting, and then I could look it up on the internet. No one knows what my number is except me. And I can look it up on the internet and make sure that I voted correctly. And this is my theory. This isn't real, but I would like it to be, because then I could say, okay, here's this, 15-digit number. I can look it up and make sure that my vote counted correctly on the internet. And you told me what you thought might be wrong with that. It's to have not only a paper vote that is counted, but also a receipt for my vote.
Right. Well, Ricky, there are a lot of people that agree with you. First, it is an idea that where there's a lot of folks who feel that this is a good idea. The reason they feel that is that there ought to be some way of really knowing that. The problem, and this is where the election officials all over the country are rolling around in agony right now, is that they're afraid of, one, either it offering the possibility of your vote being purchased by somebody else who pays you 15 or 25 bucks for a vote, and you can go to the internet and prove it by this receipt, or that you work for an employer who says, look, you know, if you want to work here, you're going to vote for candidate X. And so the concern is that your vote be entirely private, and that is one of the main protections that we have, is that we vote in the integrity of the voting booth, and nobody knows how we vote, and we don't have to be held accountable in public for that unless we want to talk about who we voted. So it gives us the ability to vote for change even if everybody around us is putting pressure on us to not do so. And so there's competing arguments on that. And
So there are people that are still going in that direction.
yeah,
I'd like to see
even
that.
if it's not something
Because you
that's,
still haven't convinced me.
No, that's fine.
There's nobody that I'm going to show my
think-
vote to that I don't want to see it.
Yeah.
And I don't see why I would show it to anybody.
well, I don't think I should convince you.
Right.
Because ultimately,
Oh, good.
deciding what to do about the voting issue is something that each citizen needs to do for him or herself.
And what about Jimmy Carter? I mean, he goes around the world trying to make the votes legitimate. And what about in this country?
Well, the Carter Center, which is his organization that works with the voting process, has addressed this a little bit. I started communicating with them in 2003. At that point, they were very, very hands-off with the issue. Since that time, after the 2004 election, they've become a little bit stronger. His statements have become a little more direct that he's concerned about voting in the United States. And he worked with James Baker, who of course was a spokesman for the Bush campaign in the recount in 2000 in Florida, and they came up with what they claimed were, you know, what were a bipartisan set of standards. The unfortunate thing is that the standards don't really go into voter verified paper, nor do they go into testing the machines to make sure that in fact they cannot be hacked and that there's no way to manipulate the software and produce results that are not what voters intended. I mean, the bottom line is your vote ought to count for who you voted for. There ought to be no way to change it, and there ought to be no way that if you want to cast that vote that you're prevented from doing so, either by not putting enough voting machines into a precinct like they did in Ohio in 2004, or by the old Jim Crow laws that they used in, you know, in the South in the
Florida.
50s and 60s. Yeah, actually in Florida 2000, they actually eliminated almost 100,000 voters who had a name similar to a felon, but were not felons themselves. And there was some just outrageous stuff on that. Among other things, one guy lost his right to vote for a felony that, according to the list, he was to commit in 2007, which is a little bit like the Tom Cruise movie where they were arresting people for
Minority Report,
Minority Report, where they were arresting people for crimes they were going to commit in the future. So there were some real outrageous things there. What people got to understand is that vote fraud, though most people are tremendously honest, most election officials are tremendously honest, there are always a few folks, you know, there's always the 1 out of 20 or 1 out of 100 who are trying to manipulate a system for their own gain. I've spent the last 8 years in Chicago, and in Chicago, vote fraud is a public sport. The line there is, you know, I want to move to Chicago before I die so I can continue to vote for a long time afterward. You know, so we know about that there, and there are other places where there's more of a Republican influence in voting, and the assumption that somehow everybody is pure and above board is really not borne out by the number of officials who are then indicted for crimes that they've committed while in office. You know, folks sometimes try and game the system, and what we need to do is to create a system where that's not going to happen.
Now, what about hacking into a machine? Is there any voting machine that cannot be hacked into?
Well, you know what? Actually, what I'd like to do is I'd like to go ahead on our list here. If we go a little forward, Craig, we get into the discussion about the machines. Actually, I'd like to start with the Chicago Sequoia debacle, which is about 3 or 4 slides ahead on the PowerPoint presentation. Yeah, thank you. This is kind of a start of that discussion, Ricky. And the reason I use this one is because I worked with these folks, and these folks are great folks. They spent 3 years researching every single voting system that was out there. They had 3 different public demonstrations where they all the vendors came in, demonstrated all the machines. You could do hands-on with them. They tested them forever. David Orr, who's the county clerk and recorder of Cook County, is a wonderful guy. He actually is a reform candidate there. He was mayor of Chicago for one day after Harold Washington died. He's never really been a member of the Daily Machine. He's very independent.
What was the conclusion?
Well, the conclusion was is they should use Sequoia voting machines.
Oh, I
Sequoia
see.
is a company, a voting machine company that used to be owned by an English company and is now ironically owned by the Venezuelans.
Oh.
So, you know, the concern is that Hugo Chavez, who a lot of conservative Americans are not very happy with because he's pretty socialistic, may have some effect on our vote.
He's the president of Venezuela.
Of Venezuela. So what actually happened in Chicago is that the back room where all the votes are decided and where they make sure that the software is working with was full of people from Venezuela who weren't even U.S. citizens, who were determining the course of a U.S. election in a room that U.S. citizens were not allowed to go into.
Wow.
And the results were disastrous. They had, they only had 40% of the vote counted 4 hours after the vote. And then like 2 days later, they still had over 400 precincts that were not counted, and they lost 250 cartridges from polling places, and they couldn't find the results from 162 suburban precincts. This is not a system that is bulletproof and is going to protect American voters. Now, both Republicans and Democrats of various organizations are suing in order to have those votes recounted. Now, fortunately, Sequoia does have a paper trail. Illinois law requires a paper trail like Montana law does. So they will be able, hopefully, as long as they can find the cartridges, they will be able to go back and recreate those votes and figure out how people intended to vote.
What is the theory of what happened there? What happened?
Well, honestly, I think there's an old line which is never attribute to fraud or theft what can be more easily attributed to human incompetence.
Okay, so it could have been that.
So,
why
they
can't
messed
we
up.
use the Sequoia machines and have, you know, American officials count the votes?
Well, frankly, what I think is that we should have local officials not only counting the votes, but also local technicians running the machines. In Montana, when we use the ES&S machines, the election systems and software machines, the technicians are going to be from somewhere else. They're going to be from Nebraska, they're going to be from New York. They're not going to be tested to make sure that they have, you know, that they don't have a criminal record or that they haven't gotten a payoff.
Are you kidding?
Or that they've got a payoff from somebody.
Oh.
You know, and they will have, some of them will have the codes to go in and actually be able to change votes on the machines.
That's here in Montana?
Yeah, and I say that with a qualification because we know that that's been the case with both the Sequoia and the Diebold machines. We're not sure of the ES&S machines because they have there's never been an attempt to hack them. I'd like to go in, you asked earlier about the hacking, so I'd like to go ahead another slide. Let's not worry about who is ES&S. Let's go into some of the problems that the ES&S, the Democratic problems and then Republican problems.
Okay, ES&S Democratic.
Elections, systems, and software. This is the voting machine.
Democrat problems, ES&S Democrat problems.
Yeah, that'll come up in a minute.
Craig will put that up for us.
So, you know, this is the system that we chose, which in many ways is the best of the bunch. It's the one that MIT recommended. It's the cheapest. It does provide a paper trail and was very successful in the...
Why does it say 2,000 canceled Venezuelan elections?
So this I'm starting out, these are the problems it's had. In the year 2000, Venezuela, which didn't have their own system then, had to cancel their national election because they had so many problems with the ES&S machine. In November 2002, in Alabama, the Democratic governor led the election in a final count the night of the election by over 3,000 votes. An ES&S machine apparently had a problem. They think it may have been an electrical spike. And magically the next day he lost 6,300 votes and he lost the election by over 3,000 votes. Now, that could have been the case, but the weird thing is because it was 3,000 votes, that was over what the state of Alabama allowed as a percentage for recount. So even though he contested it to the Alabama Supreme Court, he was never allowed to recount that election. And he just lost it over this magical 6,300 vote transformation in the middle of the night. And that, you know, that's not what we're looking for. We need to have something different going on. Right now, there's a huge problem in Texas. A very conservative Texas Supreme Court justice, he's an ex-Supreme Court justice who's running again, had a county where in 2004 he got 47% of the vote, and on the ES&S machines in 2006 he got 0 votes.
Oh my goodness.
And that's not physically possible, you know,
No.
unless he told a Texas joke. Maybe he told a Texas joke. I'm not sure, but this is, you know, this is the kind of thing that can happen. And
Now, that was a conservative
yeah,
judge, and he lost because
yeah.
of
Well,
this.
and
Okay.
there were numerous other problems with the voting machines all over Texas. There were
So
many issues.
It's not just a Republican or
Or
a
a Democrat.
Democratic.
No.
It's both sides
Yeah.
are suffering.
Yeah, and then, you know,
from-
if you go to the ES&S Republican problems, we can go into a few of those. In Dallas, in 1998, they lost 41,000 votes.
The Republicans did.
Yeah, in some of these are not listed here, but in Florida,
So this is the next page. That would
Yeah,
be
ES&S Republican
problems.
in Florida, in an election in 2003, it was a local election. There was one race on the ballot. It was a special election. It was 2 Republicans running off against each other. And the people went in to cast a vote one way or the other for this election. And when the election was over, it was only decided by 12 votes. Well, there were 137 purported no vote cast. But why in the world would anybody drive their car to the polling place, go in there, look at a race that's for 2 people, and then not choose anybody? And because there was not a paper trail, because this was the direct recording electronic machine where you just touch the touch screen, they couldn't recount, even though it was a 12-vote difference, and it was a Republican race. In Sandusky County, Ohio, in 2004, the purported turnout was 131%. And that was sort of like the Chicago vote early, vote often kind of thing going on there. You know, right this year, we've had several major failures of the ES&S machines. In Ohio, they've had to try and use their memory cards to get they've been testing them. The first time they had a 30% failure rate, the second time they had a 10% failure rate, the third time they had a 5% failure rate.
Of the memory cards.
The memory
Oh
cards,
my
you know,
goodness.
of what stores your vote.
Yes.
So then North Carolina decided to test their memory cards, even though they hadn't been informed by ES&S that there was a problem, even though North Carolina law said they had to be informed of that. But they tested them, and they had some of the same batch, and they had a very, very high failure rate. At this point, in Summit County, Ohio, the election official is saying, we're assuming that our primary election is going to fail because we cannot get memory cards that are stable enough to store the votes. So we're seeing on and on and on, one side and the other, in both primary and general elections, that there's this ongoing problem.
Now, what's this one?
Well, this is the one. This is the one I
47%.
actually mentioned earlier. That
Okay.
you got 47% of the votes in 2004 and 0% in 2006. If you want to, by the
Okay.
way, you can go to his website, which is smithforsupremecourt.com, and read the letter that they wrote. It's also on bradblog.com, which is a good source of voting information. And they go into the actual
What
letter.
kind of voting machine was that
This
one?
was an ES&S machine.
And that was a Republican who lost.
Yes,
because
it was
of
a
that
primary. You know,
machine.
he was running against another
So it's
conservative
like-
Republican. It's everybody. The only answer is that we get machines that are 100% accurate, or even better, we use paper ballots,
Yes.
where you have a physical piece of paper that you mark, and it's got the names written out in English. And that's what's, you know, and then 2 sets of eyes count all those ballots. It works well all over the world. Canada has that system. Every single country in Europe, with the exception of Holland, has that system, and they count their elections in 4 to 6 hours. It's finished. In the Chicago election, they were still counting votes 5 days later, and it was supposed to be with this electronic election technology that's supposed to save time and energy. What most of the counties have found is that the cost of running an election has gone up 2, 3, 10 times since they went from paper to the electronic
Really?
machines.
So paper is probably the answer, and making it uniform throughout the country,
Well, yeah.
especially for the national elections.
Well, it would be nice if they do that, but unfortunately, because of states' rights and the separation of powers under the Constitution, states have the right to decide their own voting system.
Really?
Yeah, so that's why in Florida, it's illegal to recount on a touch screen machine. It's illegal to recount the voting results, even in a contested
Well,
race.
is anyone trying to put forth legislation that will make it uniform
Yeah,
throughout
actually,
the
they've
country?
tried. Well, I mentioned earlier, Representative Rush Holt has a bill before Congress. It's HB 550, which Vote Trust USA has worked very, very hard to get an endorsement for. It actually has 180 co-signers in the House. Now, it would have to have 218 in order to be brought to the floor. So they haven't, the Republican majority has refused to bring it to the floor, but it's getting very, very close to the
And
point
what's
where
in there?
Well, basically it says that you have to have a paper trail. It says that you have to have a mandatory recount, I believe, of 3% of the vote, a mandatory random recount of 3% of the vote to make sure that that count actually matches what the machines have produced.
So a recount of 3% to just verify that it kind of looks the same as the whole
Yeah, the one thing I
count.
want to say is that it's not necessarily that there's fraud going on, but computers mess up. That's why the great letter that you're typing to Aunt Mildred suddenly disappears. That's what happens with Microsoft.
So they could take 3% of the vote and say, okay, it comes out, this guy lost by 50 votes, and then recount that same 3% and show, again, he lost by 50 votes, and if it's different, then maybe they'll recount the whole state.
In Missoula, we recounted in the mayoral race. We talked about this in our last session, but the recount was great. It was only 3 votes different from the account of the machines, and Vicky Zier and people here at the county clerk and recorders obviously had done a great job of managing the election. Everybody was happy with the results, including the loser, Greg Badenoch, and that's a good thing.
So
but there have been some other races where it's been so far off that it's been incomprehensible.
At Vote Trust USA, do they think that is the answer, that one legislation that might go, that hasn't gone
Well,
through?
I think that House Bill 550 is a really good compromise legislation. It doesn't go back to paper, but to just paper by itself with no machines, but it goes back to, it requires that all of the machines produce not only a voter verified paper trail, but that the voters actually be able to see that paper with their vote on it, that paper is then put into the ballot box, and that paper is then what is used for the recount.
Has the name
There's
of the
actually a
candidates.
physical record, and you can look at it and you go, yep, that's who I voted for.
Not just a space.
That's the Republican I voted for, that's the Democrat I voted for, that's the Constitutional Party candidate I voted for. My vote is recorded as I intended, and as a citizen I have performed my duty, and I know that it's going to be recognized accurately in the recount.
Now, if people contact this organization, Vote Trust USA, then is that helping to show how many numbers there are of people who are interested? Or,
yeah, they actually...
And they'll give them things to do if they're interested in volunteering?
Yeah, and they also have a real nice weekly email they send out with all the issues that are there, so you can stay informed.
And there's a lot of issues.
There's a lot of issues. They have great analysis. They do an ongoing analysis on the various issues. One that they did recently was on the auto mark system, which is the manual system for the disabled, which would work with Montana's system. And it actually lets the disabled produce a paper trail as well. A lot of the disabled systems are the touchscreen systems where they don't get a paper trail for their vote.
Okay, what about absentee ballots? Is that an issue that they deal with too?
That's an interesting issue. Some people say, well, because you're going through the mail. We've had problems with that in the past. However, there are states, Oregon being the obvious one, that that's all they do now. You vote basically absentee. Everybody votes by mail, and you have a few weeks to mail in your ballot, and they've been very, very happy with the results of that. So that is certainly a possibility. If someone's concerned about whether their vote's going to count, then there are a number of states, though not all, where you have the choice of whether you vote absentee or not. I don't believe that in Montana you have that choice. You have to demonstrate that there's a valid reason for you to vote absentee before you're allowed to vote absentee. You can't just say, I don't feel like going to the poll, or I don't trust the system. You have to have a legitimate reason here, I believe, to vote absentee.
Do you think that counting votes correctly do you think it's the #1 thing that people should be concentrating on?
Well, it's the #1 thing that happens as a citizen, is your right to vote and to determine the future of the country. And therefore, as far as I'm concerned, the most sacred right that should be protected is that your vote counts accurately. And it doesn't matter who you vote for. I believe that if a Republican wins by 4 votes, they ought to win by 4 votes. I believe if a Democrat wins by 4 votes, they ought to win by 4 votes. I believe if the Constitutional Party or the Green Party candidate wins by 4 votes, they should win by 4 votes.
You told me an interesting story in Ohio. You said that you tried to give a man an orange just to help him standing in these long, long lines during the 2004 presidential election, which I don't know if people saw in the news. They did show just people standing there for hours, and you were told, tell me what happened.
Well,
We have like 3
Ken
minutes, so.
Blackwell, the Secretary of State in Ohio, made it very difficult for people to vote. He kind of did everything he could. And the city of Columbus, Ohio, had
This
an
was
election
during the
director.
presidential
Yeah, this was during the
election.
presidential election. They had an election director who redirected where the voting machines went. So the precincts that I was working in the primary had 6 electronic voting machines, and in the general election they had 2, with 3 to 4 times the number of voters who wanted to vote. So I actually at one point was trying to give an orange to an elderly gentleman who was a brittle diabetic. In other words, if he didn't have enough blood sugar, he could collapse and die. I was trying to give him an orange. The election judge, a female election judge, told me that I could not give him the orange because that might affect the election. I was unable to do that. And I'm going, lady, it's not how he votes. He's sick and he needs help, and if you don't let me do this, he may not be able to vote at all. And in that case, she refused. Now, in other precincts, they were very open to that, and we were able to.
It's different
But we
everywhere.
actually were giving food to people until 10:30 at night because
Yeah.
they had not voted. There were places in Ohio that they did not vote until 3 and 4 in the morning.
So this is something that people could do also, and through an organization like yours. They could volunteer to be there while elections are taking place
Well,
if they allow
yeah,
you
one of the things
to
that you-
help people be able to vote
Yeah, well,
in
one of the
whatever
things
way
you can do, quite frankly, is every election district in the country needs assistance with the vote. So you can volunteer as an election judge and go in and actually help people. And I mean, it's great work, and it's one way of really being active in the system. The other thing that's there in some places is that you can go in and actually watch the count. Now, that's not every state. I don't believe in Montana you have the right to just wander in and watch the count, but there are a number of places where you do, and that's something that should be a part of the law, is that any citizen who wants to go in and watch the counting, which should be physical with paper ballots, ought to have the right to do so. You know, there shouldn't be any secret about that part of it.
Well, thank you so much, Steve, for coming on and for being such a good citizen.
Well, you know what, the benefit is seeing everyone have their vote counted accurately. And that's what we all want, is to know that our vote is counted accurately.
All right, so people look at all the information we've been putting up on the screen, and votes take place every year in different capacities all around the country. So please contact Steve or the VoteTrustUSA organization and see how you can help. And if you know of any organization that you'd like to see on What's Up Missoula, please call MCAT at 542-MCAT and let us know. Thanks, Steve.
Ricky, it was my pleasure. I really enjoyed it.